Hi, welcome to our session on economic and financial considerations for a cloud migration. My name is Daniel Feeney, and I'm a senior finance manager at Microsoft. I work in our Azure finance team, helping our customers think about how to migrate from on-premise to the cloud. Today, we're going to be discussing with you how a cloud transformation similarly has a financial transformation that goes hand in hand with it. As you're making a decision to go from an on-premise environment to a cloud environment, you're going to want to bring along your business leadership to understand what the financial implications are going to be as you're migrating from on-premise to Azure. There's going to be impacts to both financial position, accounting KPI, and to underlying processes that will impact your broader business. Additionally, as you're migrating to the cloud, you want to communicate what the financial opportunities are associated with the cloud transformation. When you move from on-premise to the cloud, there are opportunities to take advantage of cloud economic benefits that are only available when you move from an on-premise environment to a cloud environment. I'm going to hand it off to Jeff, who's going to walk through some of the financial benefits of a cloud transformation.
Thank you, Daniel. My name is Jeff Amos, and I'm a senior business planner in the cloud marketing organization at Microsoft. But I typically introduce myself to customers as a data center architect that likes to do his own taxes, meaning that I love the complexities of data centers and the dependencies that you see inside of a data center, as well as mapping that to fiduciary or financial execution of modernizing workloads from on-premise data centers to the cloud. In the next set of slides, I'm going to talk through some of the financial benefits of cloud transformation. So customers can certainly generate substantial reductions in the required cash flow to support their workloads as they move them from on-premise to the cloud. We've witnessed various levels of overall cash flow reduction supporting those workloads. In different vertical industries, they can be greater, and other vertical industries, they could be a little bit less, depending on the overall efficiencies that they have from the operational practices, as well as even from gear acquisition perspectives. Here are a couple of examples from customers that we've worked with recently in different industry verticals, and some of the benefits that they've realized from a financial perspective of moving their workloads to Azure. So when you think about the benefits of cloud migration, there's several different categories to think about. For example, there's capacity benefits, there's financial benefits, and there's also productivity benefits. Some of these overall benefits are easier to quantify and measure and project upfront. Others are a little bit more fuzzy. They're less quantifiable as you move your workloads, but they're benefits that you will realize over time. So in the capacity benefit category, certainly when you go to the cloud, you're dealing with a more elastic type of environment that caters to your workloads and may map to actual fluctuations in overall utilization based off of your business cycles. Also, with respect to capacity benefits, you have a much lower potential of having sunk costs, meaning costs that aren't actually producing revenue or delivering to the business units. From a financial perspective, you have much more variable versus fixed cost structure. Now, over the last several months, given the global financial situations, the cloud really helps on that variable aspect. Also, you have lower upfront investment with respect to moving your workloads to the cloud, where you don't have an expansive CapEx type of investment. From a productivity side, certainly the processes that are inherent in the cloud provide much more efficient processes, especially from an operations standpoint, where you can provision workloads in a much more rapid fashion. And equally important, you can deprovision workloads equally as fast. So if a workload isn't being fully utilized by the business unit, you could retract those and reallocate the budget that previously supported them. So when we think about projecting potential costs as you move workloads to the cloud, you first want to quantify the cost that you have on premise, and also looking at the different various taxonomies of costs that roll into your entire on-premise cost. This is a good representation of the on-premise cost that is inclusive of network, potential headcount, that DevOps type of staffing, or ITSM, IT service management staffing, as well as power consumption, building costs, which can be your amortization cost or even your colo type of agreements, as well as your server costs, which can be inclusive of gear acquisition time and the depreciation schedule attached to that. But when we look at overall data center capacity, we tend to think about it in power consumption. And in this particular example, the power consumption really mapping to server and power consumption within the data center, we notice that it is not at full capacity. In essence, we are building data centers for those peak times within a financial term. And that results in excess capacity as well as excess spend overall. So when you're thinking about your on-premise costing, do keep in mind that typically those data centers are over-provisioned, both from a power consumption perspective and potentially even from a server perspective. So when you start looking at your on-premise data center and the resources that are supporting the business unit applications, as well as the line of business applications, a great way to think about it is starting with the base workloads. Those workloads that have a steady, long-running state. Those could be the line of business apps or revenue-generating applications that are customer-facing. Next, look at those fluctuations on top of those base workloads. These could have inherent seasonal business patterns. For example, the retail vertical industry has 4 to 6 spikes throughout the year of utilization of their data center resources. Oil and gas has very spiky utilization depending on their exploratory research of more territories. Understanding these business cycles as they map to utilization in your data centers is super critical, because it allows you to set a base workload, that long-running instances that you could apply longer-term commits and a better price point to. And then those fluctuations would be applied to other licensing or consumption constructs in the cloud. And then third, and equally important, is identifying those unused capacity components within your data center. They could be components that are well beyond just compute, but potentially storage or even network balancing transport type of mechanisms that aren't fully utilized and could actually be deprecated as you move those workloads to the cloud. Another great way to think about your adoption of the cloud and modernizing your workloads is that this is an iterative type of approach, both from a financial and technical perspective. So start with what you have on premise and then start looking at your lift and shift scenario of taking your workloads to infrastructure as a service, the virtual machine targets in Azure. When you go through that particular migration or modernization, we tend to find that the overall reduced cash flow requirement to support the workloads is reduced. And we found that customers are able to take up that freed up budgetary allocation and then apply it to modernizing the workloads from the lift and shift category into the platform as a service category, modernizing their applications and modernizing their workloads. As we see this progression, we see an acceleration of the reduction of overall required cash flow. In essence, we're achieving more with every dollar of investment as we take the workloads from on-premise through lift and shift to the IaaS target and into platform as a service, and eventually and potentially even to commodity type of services, that being the software as a service layers inside of Azure. In essence, we want to position you to be able to leverage in a better way every dollar of investment that you have into your infrastructure. So at this point in time, I will hand it back to Daniel, who will cover some of the financial positionings and changes within a cloud journey.
There are 3 key financial statements that every business leader looks at: an income statement, a balance sheet, and a cash flow statement. The income statement focuses on the economic income during a period of time. It includes things like depreciation as opposed to your cash flows. A balance sheet is a view of the assets and liabilities of a company. It includes things like your servers that are sitting on your balance sheet today. Finally, a cash flow statement is just a view of what the cash flows were in a given period. When you're moving to the cloud, your income statement has depreciation and data center operating expenses that become cloud expenses. From a balance sheet perspective, we're actually able to remove the fixed cost structure that's inherent from an on-premise environment. In an on-premise world, I have assets like servers that are sitting on my balance sheet, creating a fixed expense. When we move from on-premise to the cloud, that capital expenditure, that assets that's sitting on our books, now becomes cloud spend. And I no longer need to provision ahead of time. I can actually pay for resources as I need them. From a cash flow perspective, I'm able to take upfront cash flows and move them out over time. So where I used to have upfront capital expenditures, I now have overtime expenses. These are all key benefits that are associated with the migration to the cloud. From a KPI perspective, our business leaders are going to want to understand what changes when migrating from on-premise to the cloud. In an on-premise environment, you tend to have capital expenditures, and capital expenditures have associated budgets. When those capital expenditures move over to operating expenditures, budget dollars need to change. And so financial leaders are going to need to understand how those dollars are shifting from one pocket to another. Additionally, certain KPI experience changes when moving from on-prem to the cloud. EBITDA is a good example. EBITDA is a view of operating expenditures where you get to add back your depreciation and your amortization. So it's effectively your income, but you're adding back some server-related depreciation costs. When you're moving to the cloud, you no longer have depreciation, you have cloud spend. And so you're no longer able to kind of add that cost back. It's purely a financial related KPI. It doesn't actually reflect the real health of the business. So we always encourage business leaders to think about how real cash flows are changing. Additionally, when you're moving from on-premise to the cloud, you get the benefit of more predictability and better cash flow timing. You're no longer saddled with irregular overtime capital spend. I bought a server last year and I won't need to spend for 4 more years. That creates unpredictable cash flows. When we're in the cloud, we have more consistent overtime spend that overall helps our business. So now we're going to discuss a little bit about how a business case from a cloud migration perspective might look. And what we're going to talk about is how your cost structure is going to change over time when you're moving from on-prem to the cloud. And what you can see represented here is going to be a view of how that cost structure changes. And we're going to build it out until you see the full view of an overall business case. So when we're starting, we're looking at what our on-premise cost structure looks like, what it looks like today, and then we're going to think about how that's going to change over time. So we're going to start with certain buckets of spend: servers, data center spend, power and cooling, and then potentially headcount associated with running those environments. Initially, from an income statement perspective, we're going to think about how those on-prem cost structures reduce over time. And so you can see here that you start with that 100% environment, and it does take a certain amount of time to migrate out of that on-prem cost structure while you're making that cloud migration and while you're adding on some of those Azure expenditures. When we compare an income statement view with a cash flow view, you can actually see there's a little bit of a different kind of financial story. Your income statement view includes those things like depreciation, which are based upon your historical asset structure. A cash flow view is more representative of the real immediate savings. When I have a cash flow view, I'm able to more quickly reduce my capital expenditures and my operating expenditures in line with my migration costs. In that income statement view, you actually experience server depreciation from servers that were, say, purchased last year, still incurring expenses on my income statement. So we view the cash flows view as a great way to understand how your immediate cash flows can be impacted from that cloud transformation. When we then take the next step and look at how the Azure costs layer on, we see that CapEx reduces fairly drastically, operating expenditures also reduces over time, and our Azure spend slowly starts to increase as we're undertaking our migration. We then layer on top of that Azure cost any upfront migration costs. This gives us a more comprehensive view of what upfront costs are going to be for that Azure environment. And so over time, we're able to see how our financial picture is changing. We're reducing our capital spend, our on-prem OpEx is reducing, and we're replacing much of that with Azure costs. Additionally, in the early years of our migration, we're also going to have some costs associated with migrating the environment and spending in order to move workloads from on-prem to the cloud. When we're thinking about a cloud transformation, we always want to compare it to what an on-premise environment looks like. We want a comparative view of how the financial picture will change when going from a status quo or an on-prem scenario into an Azure-based scenario. And so what you can see in this view is a dashed red line that represents what the on-prem cost would be in kind of an illustrative view. The dashed blue line represents the Azure case, and that's comprehensive of all of the spend that is included in that Azure scenario. That includes things like on-prem OpEx in the early years, on-prem CapEx, and also upfront migration costs that can be offset to a degree by Microsoft investments. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff, who's going to talk a little bit more about how we go about and think about developing a business case.
Thank you, Daniel. So some of the most critical things to really understand and dive into when you're building a business case are certainly environmental scopes, and that looking at your entire footprint, not just a particular workload, but your investment into the data center as a whole, and even regional data centers. And within that environmental scope, as you're collecting the data, you're going to have two different aspects. One is certainly technical. What's the resource allocation at a compute unit level? Number of cores, memory footprint that's allocated to that particular unit. You might even leverage some discovery tools like Mover or Cloudomize or some of the third-party tools to look at the utilization of those resources at a unit level. Equally important is starting to dive into the financial aspects that are supporting that workload and resource allocation. Next is building a baseline financial set of data. What is the required cash flow that supports these workloads today? So you have a baseline KPI to measure against. Next is to work through some of the projections of on-prem cost in that on-prem scenario. And then working in the projections of those on-prem costs in an Azure scenario, as well as mapping in timelines of how that migration might look. In a lot of cases, you might leverage a migration factory where you have a higher number of compute unit moves in a certain term versus a manual type of migration where you have a lower number of compute units moved in the same term. This helps you create that migration timeline and overall Azure costs mapped back to your current cash flow requirements to support the workloads that you have today, which gives you a great KPI mapped to a timeline. So with that in mind, there's fundamental differences between a TCO, a business case, and really what I classify as a cloud financial model. In this particular image, it represents what historically has been a TCO, or a total cost of ownership type of analysis within an overall migration to the cloud. And a TCO is typically a point-in-time focused analysis. Does this make sense? And are we getting a reduced cash flow overall to support these workloads? However, when we think about cloud adoption and migration, we have more of a timeline or a journey. So we could think about it in the terms of a cloud financial plan, where it provides more of a technical view of execution as well as a financial timeline map to that. It allows you to dive deeper into the financials of that migration timeframe, which typically we view as a double mortgage period where you still have depreciation cost of your workloads on premise. You're paying for potential execution of the migration, and then you're also taking on new cost of those Azure meters, those cloud meters, as you move those workloads. And then also within that overall timeline, you have cost optimization even after you've moved to the cloud. You might be able to modernize some of your workloads to the PaaS layers, where you're getting additional benefits of per dollar investment out of every workload that you have out there. So really think about it as more of a financial plan or a financial roadmap over time that has components of a TCO as well as components of that additional cost, that double mortgage period that you have within the migration execution timeframe. Certainly, as we look to developing and implementing a business case, there's some additional considerations that are equally critical, especially to the business leadership. Certainly, one, reducing the on-premise asset acquisition, meaning business units will continually request additional workloads to be located in the on-premise data centers. Setting up processes that make that a little bit more challenging, like a cloud center of excellence team that will approve or deny different requests coming in from the business units, is certainly a process that is critical to mitigating further spend that is more in the CapEx or restrictive category. Another thing to keep in mind is as you execute a migration, it's a great time to do some spring cleaning of workloads and deprecating services or specific nodes that aren't either catering to a line of business app or are really catering to like legacy requests that are no longer further utilized. Another aspect is doing right-sizing activities of what resource allocations are currently in place at a per compute unit level. Meaning that you might have a 20-core or 24-core system, but really there's only about 10% utilization, so you could shrink it down to a much lower resource allocation at a unit level. Also keep in mind that this is not a one-time fire and forget type of exercise. It's a continuous cost optimization type of exercise. So whatever you deploy to the cloud, certainly revisit that, measure it against where you previously have been, being on-premise, or over the last couple of months, comparing that to other workloads that you have in the cloud and doing those analysis. Another thing to keep in mind is as you move to the cloud, you have a richer set of tagging and categorizing your particular workloads, which you actually help you from several different perspectives. One, doing easier chargebacks to the business units, if that's your internal operating model. or even helping you categorize your spend from an accounting perspective in a much more effective way. And one of the last points here I certainly want to emphasize is leveraging some of the unique benefits that Microsoft brings to the table with respect to license portability and hybrid benefits in and around license portability, both for Windows Server as well as SQL instances that could dramatically reduce your overall licensing requirements. So as a next step and a call to action, we wanted to share a little bit of resources and some go-do activities. Certainly bring your finance partners in early. Within your customer base, engage with the finance folks in the finance organization. And at that point in time, you could refer to some of the cloud adoption frameworks, which where we share some of the historic learnings of migrations and data or cloud adoption. Next, look at some of the cost savings offers that we have on Microsoft.com and Azure.com, including, as I mentioned, the Azure hybrid benefit, or even leveraging reserved instances for those long-running workloads that you have in your data center, as well as some of the online tools that we offer, that total cost of ownership calculator, as well as the Azure pricing calculator. And certainly look at some of the continuous optimization services that are available within pre-existing subscriptions, available through the Azure Cost Management Portal, as well as Azure Advisor, where they recommend even, different licensing constructs for maybe those long-running instances that we mentioned, and will list out potential reserved instance candidates that you have pre-existing in your environment. And for expert assistance, certainly consider joining the Azure Migration Program, because that could help simplify your move to the cloud with some of the best practice guidance, as well as direct access to Azure engineers and even subsidized partner services to help you execute your move. Thank you for your time today. It was a pleasure to share this content with you. For me, it's a whole new realm of analysis in and around modernizing workloads and cloud adoption. It really blends some of my architectural experience in data centers with the financial aspects. I want to thank Daniel for joining me in this presentation. It's always fantastic to present and learn things from him from the finance team. So thank you, Daniel, for your time today as well.
Thanks, Jeff. And I want to thank everyone for listening into this call. We want to unlock all of the value possible from a digital transformation. And we think an important component to that is also the financial value that you can unlock. And so we really hope you take to heart some of the discussions we've had and really work closely and quickly with some of the business partners on the finance side to really unlock the value of the cloud. Thank you.